So this is going to be a hot space. Number of people going after it. But the question is, do you think there will be a sustainable technical differences between the products? This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. My guest for this episode is Thomas Pace. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thanks, Dale. Happy to be here.
I'm going to give you a little bit of a bio here. I hope it's not too flattering or embarrassing for you. It's quite a career. Tom started as a Marine, has worked in the banking center and security, the petrochem sector, black hat instructor, and probably the one that he's most known for because it's the most recent. He worked for Cylance prior to their acquisition by BlackBerry, ending as the senior director of worldwide consulting. He's been on 60 Minutes. He's been on John Oliver's show. But what we're really here to talk about is your latest endeavor. In January 2021, Tom started NetRise along with Michael Scott and announced in November a $6.8 million seed round as you left, I guess, your stealth mode. So quite a background here. And if I was to characterize your firm, you can maybe put it in a different bucket, but your firmware security analysis, is that accurate, or would you put it a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty decent characterization. I mean, what I like to kind of highlight about this is providing visibility to, I think the best term is really like the XIoT device landscape. And I know everyone's like, great, another acronym to track on and try and make heads or tails of, which I think we're all frustrated by that. But I think, and by the way we do that is obviously by analyzing the firmware of these devices.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So NetRise has a technology that will analyze firmware, the security of firmware, and obviously we have a lot of firmware in the ICS world, a lot of PLCs and devices and network infrastructure things, and a lot of things that have firmware. Some that we share with IT, some that are dedicated for OT, but there's a tremendous amount of it. Your current model is, or NetRise's current model is that people would send their firmware to you in the cloud. I know when we talked a week or two ago, or maybe it was a month ago, you were going over this. Why did you choose the model of a cloud-based solution as opposed to perhaps selling a product to
like
asset owners or vendors?
Like an on-prem solution? Or,
yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
So number one, we are selling to the like asset owners and manufacturers as well. I think there's certainly certain industries that have requirements that make cloud-based solutions a challenge, but I find those industries to be diminishing at a rapid pace as time goes on. Now, there'll always be certain industries where that's the case. I would imagine, such as the intelligence community and certain DoD elements and things like that. But this was I used to deal with this a ton at Cylance, right? We would go into clients, and a lot of companies back then were still used to having their antivirus solution on-prem and having their AV management server. And the only thing that was connecting to the internet was to download new signatures or updates, right? So we have a decent amount of experience in explaining to people that, hey, if your email's in the cloud and your HR stuff is in the cloud from Workday, and your source code might even be in the cloud if you're using GitLab or something like that, then having this in the cloud as well is not really a far reach. For the enterprise, for the people using these devices, it's not a far reach at all. For some of the manufacturers and asset owners and things like that, it can be a bit different, but a lot of those folks we've talked to already as well are managing their source code in the cloud already as it is. So it's not that big of a stretch is what I would say. Now, will we develop an on-prem solution? I'm sure that we will eventually when that need becomes pronounced enough, or quite frankly, when somebody wants to write us a big enough check to do it, then sure. But but right now it's a cloud-based thing. We've also considered like a hybrid solution as well, which we have a lot of experience with too, because same kind of thing. We had that problem at Silence as well, where you have like an on-prem thing and then some kind of proxy essentially that can manage stuff for you.
Well, I know a lot of people, especially those in OT and even more so those with OT security backgrounds, will sometimes recoil when they hear cloud.
Sure.
But to me, it makes a lot of sense. I actually think it's a good solution, because if you're a small company and you want on-prem, well, then you're probably going to pay more for an on-prem solution if you're only testing a small amount of software.
That's right.
If you're a large company, so let's say I'm Honeywell or Schneider Electric or something like that, if I want an on-prem solution, it's probably not a single on-prem solution, or else I have to deal with the whole thing of how do I give all these different teams access. I almost have to create my own, either locally hosted cloud-like environment or cloud-hosted environment for this. So it's kind of tough. The case for on-prem really, where it really makes sense to me, is only in those places, like you say, like intelligence areas, classified things, where you just, by law, you're not allowed to do such things. And those are pretty limited. I hope you stick to your guns. I actually think, forcing people to the cloud is better, but obviously that's a business decision.
Yeah. I mean, this was one of the reasons that a lot of these cloud-based, endpoint security companies came into existence, is especially at the bigger clients. Say it's not picking on any particular vendor, that they were all this way. McAfee, Sophos, Symantec, doesn't really matter. I don't know, say you're a big bank or anyone's just like has a big landscape, you're managing like tens to hundreds of management servers. It's just, you end up having to hire 4 people to just like manage a solution that, quite frankly, probably wasn't even providing you that much value in the first place. And so, that's really the big piece. And in terms of sticking to your guns, I mean, we're going to, there's Dimitri, the co-founder of Crowdstrike, talked about this a lot, actually, in the early days of Crowdstrike, when they were going after some bigger financial services clients, and they were just like, there's no way, we're never going to the cloud. And then 4 years later, they were all in CrowdStrike's cloud. So in CrowdStrike, they were like, we're not building it on-prem. So that's it. Ended up. So it's our job to get people to come around where that's a challenge. And I mean, as well as I do, like there's even all this talk around like virtualization of PLCs and all of this other stuff. Well, I mean, that might be a bit of a ways away to be like deployed at scale, but I think it's going to be here to stay.
Well, and that could be different, because you could have a virtualized PLC that's on-prem.
On-prem, sure.
Right. So I think the key here is what you're doing is not an operational function. So it's not part of the process control system. It's more of analyzing the process control system. So putting it on-prem really doesn't have that same availability issue that you would see in an operational environment. Well, let's go forward then. So let's say I want to use this. So I would imagine you've got asset owner customers and obviously vendor customers. What do they have to send to get something analyzed? Do they have to send you source code? Can they send you compiled firmware and you deal with that? What do they send you?
Yeah, so typically it's a compiled firmware image, right? Now, obviously, we've built a really robust, awesome extraction framework, so we can extract, get to a file system or get to a whatever, if it happens to be like a real-time operating system versus like an embedded Linux image, which is the majority of what we see still at this point, at least. So, if they have proprietary compression algorithms or nested file systems or whatever it is, we've been able to address all of those things. It typically needs to be unencrypted also, for, I think, obvious reasons. However, that being said, we've certainly been able to navigate around encrypted firmware as needed in some scenarios. But in terms of the source code question, when we're working with manufacturers, we don't require source code to do what we do, but it certainly helps in the sense of, it gives us better data to align, particularly around like component identification, right? So, and to be honest, we don't need the source code for that. We can just like ask them, like, hey, this thing has 100 components on it. We've been able to identify 75 of them. These other 25, if you can give us this information, it will allow us to give you a better outcome at the end of the day.
Okay.
So it's not required, and it's certainly, we're not going to get it if we're analyzing devices of people using these things because they don't even have the source code. So we built this platform operating under the assumption that we are not going to have source code, and we're doing basically zero knowledge analysis on compiled binaries, whether that be firmware or individual binary itself.
Right. And I think that would maybe be the difference between a vendor sending it to you. Obviously, the vendor, well, not in all cases, the vendor might want to see what somebody could do if they didn't have any special knowledge. So they might want you to run it first through without any hints and then give you everything so they can find out. I mean, kind of your black box, white box testing, just a different way of looking at it.
That's
but
exactly.
your asset owners are a little different because the vendors might say, look, no, we don't want you looking at this.
Yeah.
You get this file. We're not going to help you look at it. And it's funny when you mentioned the encryption. Reed Whiteman, who used to work for me, now he's with Dragos, used to call it encryption. That a lot of that stuff is, just simple XORing a fixed field or something like that. But I would imagine if someone actually did it well, it might be hard to pull some of that source code out. I mean, maybe that's
for sure.
You're finding so far you're not running into that problem too often, though.
We have ran into encrypted firmware that we can't like get around, like maybe twice.
Okay.
We've also, you can end up just buying some of these devices if you need to, and then you can just get the keys off that way because that's how it's symmetric encryption typically. When we have talked to a couple companies who are like, hey, we're actually doing really good PKI here, and we're storing, the private keys here and the public key here, and so that'd be a big challenge. We're not in the business of compromising manufacturers' cloud infrastructure to break their encryption, obviously. But we have come across many scenarios in which we get our hands on the decryption key and determine that affects a significant corpus of that company's firmware. So, and then we just plug that into our extraction framework, and then it's one of the keys that just get used as things get uploaded. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about the analysis here. So you put it in this, you put it in this engine, which pulls it apart so it's able to be analyzed. And then you do some analysis of it. What would be the major buckets or the major categories of analysis that you're looking at?
Yeah. So after you upload a image and it goes through the analysis phase, you get a report that's, in the dashboard and everything. And it's broken into a handful of different tabs. So you have like a summary tab that says, here's like a risk score. Here's, some high level metadata about that firmware and or the device itself, manufacturer, processor architecture, operating system, if we're able to identify these things. And then we also provide you with a donut of the vulnerabilities based on criticality and whatnot, and then give you like a top offenders list that shows whatever OpenSSL and BusyBox and whatever are the top offenders. We give you a top 10 or 15 components we've identified, and then like open source licensing information that we also strip out. And then we kind of go down and we have a cryptography tab that goes through like certificates, private keys, public keys. And then we do analysis to say, are these valid? Are these expired? And we highlight that for you to make it like very clear. We give you the encryption algorithms, the bits, like all the metadata what you would come to expect. And then another really cool thing that we do, and we do this for every artifact that exists that we pull out, whether that's a credential, a certificate, a binary, a vulnerability, whatever. And we can tell you, we correlate these things across all the other firmware that's in your particular tenant. And we say, okay, we've identified this expired certificate. Let's say that's a big problem for you for whatever reason. You can click on the correlations column and it'll tell you these other images also have this expired certificate, like super fast. I mean, just real time, it's already done. And what you find is, unsurprising, I think, is multiple manufacturers are using like the same things. And so you see like how one vulnerability can affect all these different pieces and parts. And then so next, like I mentioned, is credentials. So we're pulling credentials out of all the usual locations when we come to expect, but we're also looking for them in, binaries, configuration files, things like that as well. And then if we find them and they're hashed or something like that, we attempt to crack them, and we usually do. We have a few, password cracking rigs that make that feasible. And then is the the binaries page. So we basically evaluate every binary and look at it. Does it have binary protection mechanisms in place? If so, which ones? And so that all that data kind of feeds a risk score. And then we give you the vulnerabilities that are there. So we give you like the CVSS 2 and 3 data, the attack vector, all the things that you can kind of get out of the NVD. But then we also, we're in the process right now actually of doing some really significant enrichment there. So in like prioritization. So is it exploitable? How long has an exploit been around? Is that exploit available in Metasploit or Exploit DB, et cetera, et cetera? There's about 20 or 30 other fields that we're going to be using from a prioritization and enrichment perspective there. And then the last part of that column is the file system, if there is a file system. And so you can go in there, download files in real, if you want to do like offline analysis and things like that. We do some cool tagging and make specific icons for different file types and things like that to just make things more visually, I guess, appealing, but also give you some additional immediate feedback on what these things are. So that's most of the analysis at high level.
I know, and I'm not a developer, but I know, for example, if you're developing for Microsoft environments, some of their development tools will, for example, flag functions you should not use and other bad practices that say when you're developing your system, you should not do this pre-compile. They'll tell you these things. Are you looking for things like that as well?
Yeah. So some of that stuff is, we have a great problem right now, I think. We have way more data on our back end than is in the front end. I'd rather have that problem than the opposite. So we can do a lot of CWE checks and things like that. We're doing some additional optimizations around there for finding insecure functions. There's a lot of binaries to analyze at scale. So identifying those insecure functions. Also, one of the other things that's coming very soon is secure configuration checking. So here's this SSH config or this DNS config or whatever it is. Does this align with kind of security best practices, or are there any issues here that we need to flag for the user or developer of this firmware? So as we move on and go further down this road, we're 13 months into this thing only right now. Right now, it's about getting as much of that data in there as we can from a a parsing perspective, I guess. That being said, we are doing some limited static, dynamic, and emulation. But as time goes on, the focus is going to move way more to that side of the static, dynamic, and emulation of advanced binary analysis and doing things like that, which is really a lot of the bread and butter of the team at this company. So we're looking forward to that.
Now, one other thing, when I was looking at your site at netrise.io, I saw that you were talking, you had these little boxes with, I guess, feature benefits in them. And two of them were talking about continuous monitoring and real-time notifications. To me, I was trying to see where the big win on that. I guess if there's new vulnerabilities that are found, you could quickly go through your database for your own company and say, oh yeah, this affects us, this doesn't affect us. But other than that, is that mainly what you mean by continuous and real time? Because once you have a firmware image, it doesn't change unless you upload a new firmware image, right? It's kind of fixed at that point in time.
That's correct. Yeah, so that's one aspect there. I mean, obviously this is a SaaS platform, so we're adding new features and capabilities all of the time. So if you upload that firmware image today, and we're doing like vulnerability identification and analysis, next month, we might also be doing some other static or dynamic analysis of all your binaries. So you're going to be, it's a continuous value of that platform that's obviously not going to incur any additional cost. So the vulnerability piece is one thing. You know, as time goes on, more certificates are going to get expired. As time goes on, maybe certain binary protection mechanisms will fall out of favor for whatever reason. So different security configuration checks will be put in there, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a ton we have, which we didn't really talk about yet, but in the searching capability of the platform is super important. Like the Log4j thing that just happened for the folks that are using our platform, they were able to figure out if they had the Log4j vulnerability in about 10 seconds, right? They didn't need to reach out to all of their manufacturers and say, hey, do we have this? Now, to be fair, Log4j isn't exactly a huge problem in the firmware space, though we did find it in a handful of manufacturer things. So as we add, one of the ways that we play this catch-up game with like data on the back end versus what's in the front end is we make that stuff available in search first. So like the parsers and that new parser, represent them in the front end, like with new UI, UX elements, we make them searchable in the search interface. So
just one other kind of product question before we talk about business models. Actually, two more. One is VEX. So you've got your SBOMs tell you everything that's in there, but we've seen many examples where yes, the software with the vulnerability is in there, but it's not exploitable, and that's where VEX comes in to help identify which ones are and are not exploitable. Are you attempting to determine the exploitability yourself? Are you just taking in the VEX feed if you're doing it for a vendor, for basically feeding in whether it's exploitable or not into your database, or how are you dealing with that issue?
I get this question a lot, Dale. So to me, this is like a 3 to 4 phased answer. So phase one is ensuring you've identified the component properly, right?
Yeah.
And that can be problematic for a whole lot of reasons that are pretty unique to the firmware space, actually. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that we've done that.
Okay.
The next step is validating that the vulnerability exists, which is a particular challenge in this space that's not really a big challenge in like Windows, right? If they say a vulnerability exists, it usually exists. What we've seen here, which is actually a really interesting thing, is people can download open source components. They leave in whatever metadata or functions or whatever way in which we're identifying that component present to give us a high degree of confidence that that is in fact the component, but then maybe delete some other things in there, which were the insecure functions that are the reason the vulnerability exists. And so that's a problem, right? So we are doing things there, around like function hashing and some other tricks. The next step is there an exploit available? Is it being used? We have a bunch of other data we're bringing in to determine that. That can give us additional focus and prioritization. And then, is it exploitable in the context of this device, in how it runs, is the last question. So we can do the last question at scale in a totally automated way. Yet we're getting there. But one of the ways we're kind of addressing this is, let's imagine as a result of our vulnerability prioritization, we end up saying we found 100 vulnerabilities. These 10 are the 10 we're really concerned about. Well, now we don't need to answer that last question for 100 things. We need to answer that last question for 10, which is a much more reasonable thing to do. And so we can provide a bolt-on services thing or something like that if folks want us to really like evaluate and determine that. Now, that being said, this is a problem that we are diving into head first and that we really want to be able to totally address. There's enormous challenges here, right? Emulation is probably required in a handful of scenarios, and being able to hit things from the network also. And so doing those things in a scalable, automated way and keeping your cogs within reason is tricky. So it's kind of solving the first problem first, I guess.
Okay, so I think I lost you a little bit there. So just to really boil it down, and again, this is really new stuff. So
Yeah.
I think it's something that a lot of organizations or companies like yours trying to solve this problem are trying to figure out a strategy and put it in place.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point in time, are you bringing in VEX feeds from vendors and using that to populate your database and affect your risk score?
If they have them and they are willing to provide them to us, absolutely. So
Okay.
I mean, I can think of one case where that's the case, but that's
Okay.
right now.
And then in terms of determining exploitability itself, that sounds like that's something where it's a little kind of in flux at this point. It's not something you do for every vulnerability, but you may, if there's a high priority vulnerability, you may write some code to be able to test it. Am I interpreting that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, I think my last question, this is probably the big question for me, the one that I really am trying to get a handle on, is we see a number of people. I had Finite State on this show over a year ago. There's a number of other people looking at it. My guess is more are going to jump in because of all the buzz this area is getting now related to supply chain and SBOMs and things that we're seeing the government put out a lot of content on this, and so our industry. So this is going to be a hot space. Number of people going after it. But the question is, do you think there will be a sustainable technical differences between the products? Because a lot of things I let you go on there for quite a while in terms of this is what we're doing. And I hear that from a number of people. So, I mean, in a way, that's right in the sense of, yes, these are the right things we should be looking at. There's some consensus on that.
Yep.
But then these companies are all saying they're going to do it. Do you think that someone's going to have an advantage and be better year over year for a couple of years at doing this? Or is this like antivirus where everyone kind of gets to the same level and you're not really competing on technical ability?
I'm really happy you brought up that specific analogy. So that's the last thing we want to be the case, is we walk into a room and, we're one legacy antivirus vendor and this other company is another legacy antivirus vendor. And we're like, but our signatures are really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we want to be. So the reason I'm happy you mentioned the antivirus comparison is a lot of the people at this company are from Tanium, Cylance, the NSA.
Mm-hmm.
Really big focus on machine learning at this company. Like, it's really important. We've done some things from day one that are enabling us to build arbitrary machine learning models based on use cases that can happen really fast, right? Like let's imagine we figure out it's going to be super important for us to build a password model based on X, Y, or Z. We can do that super fast as a result of like the pipelines we've built and things like that. So over time, this data and security analytics in the machine learning models that we have developed and that we are developing, I think are going to be the significant differentiator of us against other people. And the big part of that is, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's somewhere around 30 to 40 machine learning model patents for the employees here at NetRise. I don't know if any other companies have something close to that. If they do, I'm unaware of it, I think. My co-founder developed, is the primary inventor on the patents that he worked on at Tanium. And we've got some guys from Obsidian and worked on a lot of this big static analysis models at Silence as well. So we view this as a data problem more so than I think other folks. Applying that same mindset to just firmware. So I think that's going to be the really big technical differentiation for us. Now that, like I said, we're 13 months in, we hired a ton of people in the last like 8 weeks. So that's all going really well. So we've already developed 2 or 3 models, and that velocity is about to get much, much faster for some of those big problems that we kind of talked about already.
Okay. So I guess the short answer is you think yes.
Yes.
You think there will be sustainable technical differences between the solutions. And I don't say that necessarily as a bad thing. For example, I think if you were to look at the OT detection space, which I covered very closely, I don't think the technology really decided who won in that space. There were some excellent competitors in what I would call the second and third tier, who technically for a long time were just as good. They just were not as operationally sound. They didn't make it easy for the customers to buy and use their products. Maybe their install and support wasn't good. So there's a lot to providing a solution, which maybe is a good way to pivot to business models. You say you're 13 months in, so obviously very new. I'm sure anyone who wants to buy your service, you're happy to sell it to them. But I've really been looking at this. To me, I'm less convinced about the technical differences. I think the business models, to me, are the most fascinating things, just because you said, I believe earlier, you said you've got a lot more data in the back end than you have in the front end. And I believe that's, that makes sense. I would make the claim that most of the at least asset owning customers, maybe to a lesser extent vendors, but asset owners can't handle the information you have on the front end today. It's just like they're overwhelmed. They can barely handle all the Windows and primary application patches, let alone all this other stuff. How do you see someone actually buying and using this? Who is it? Is it the vendor? Is it the asset owner? How would they, once they buy this and get this information, how do they use this in a way that doesn't require them to spend a huge amount of money just to use your tool?
Yeah, great question. So to take a half a step back, a fundamental philosophy at NetRise is that we do not view this problem as a vertically aligned problem. We view this problem as a horizontal problem. This is not an ICS problem. It's not a medical device problem. It's not an automotive component problem. It's a firmware problem. That's the problem. Why would an analogy I've used a million times is, if we can analyze embedded Linux firmware, why would I only do that for industrial control systems, or only do it for medical devices or whatever?
Sure.
Here's the answer, I think, though. Most of the people that are in this space have come from a very specific background their entire career. They've spent all their whole career in ICS. They've spent their entire career in healthcare and medical devices. They've spent their entire career in automotive security. So they create a company and target that market. Makes perfect sense, right? The difference with this team is we've all been at giant security companies selling to all of these people in the past. We're just as comfortable talking to an ICS manufacturer as we are to a hospital, as we are to a bank, as we are to a whoever. So that's one component, which I think is super important. In terms of like the use, and another analogy I've used is around EDR, right? Mm-hmm. Our company is just like living in their EDR all day, every day. Sure, some are like that are doing like some advanced threat hunting stuff and all that, great. But the point is, when the time comes and you need to ask questions of these devices and leverage this data set, this is the only thing that's going to have those answers for you. And so Log4j is like the most recent great example of that. And this was the problem that I had when I was at Department of Energy at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and I was dealing with like heartbleed and shell shock at the time. I had no way to determine what was impacted. So I said, oh, I'm a smart guy. I'll reach out to the manufacturers. They couldn't tell me. And so what we want to do is put that power back into the end user's hands and not have to reach out to 10, 20, 100 manufacturers to ask a basic question. They can just figure it out on their own now. So it's not to say someone's going to walk in the door every day and live in the platform all day. If they do that, great. Another thing is, this is not meant to be hey, I have 100 vulnerabilities. You better have 50 vulnerabilities next month. That's not the objective necessarily. It's about providing visibility into these devices so that we can finally make like data-driven risk decisions, which people are not making right now. They're not making a decision based on any data right now. And so now, what can those decisions be? We can answer that too. But we're finally migrating to a place with these types of devices where people can leverage data to figure out what they want to do. Whereas before, it's like you just bought a thing and plugged it in and hoped for the best. And that model was kind of crazy to me. So that's why we started this, and that's how we kind of, evaluate the market and how people will use it.
Well, the vendor model, to me, is the easy one, right?
It's much more clear. It's much more clear.
Right. I have all these products that I generate.
Yep.
I could have my own SBOM. I could have my own tracking mechanisms. I could do this. And some of them were actually good and were doing this 10, 20 years ago, but that was kind of a very small percentage that, if you'd say what's actually in the product,
yep,
that they would be tracking that. And a lot of times it was tracked on spreadsheets and just wasn't really that practical. Some did better. I should give some vendors are better, but when we would ask those questions, you could tell by the way we got the answers that they really didn't have a handle on it. So I could see how a vendor could do this, and they could say, we've got all these different development teams. We're just going to send them all to this vendor to do this for us, and we can query it whenever we want. That makes sense. The asset owner side is a lot harder for me, because if I'm an asset owner, I would much rather just be able to query a database rather than have to deal with uploading it and telling you everything I have. So I would not want to, you're asking me now every time, for example, if I think about like just PLCs, embedded devices, you go to a lot of companies, they have a lot of different PLCs running on a lot of different versions of firmware.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, I've got to do that. That's going to be a lot of work for them to accomplish that, to upload it and track it and that sort of thing. Whereas I could see if they could just say, hey, I'm considering upgrading from this version to that version, and just let me ask a vendor what the difference is in risk score between those two versions without having to go through the whole process of having you analyze it.
Yeah.
Do you see a time in the future where a vendor like NetRise or somebody else could have this database of information that you could sell access to on subscription?
Absolutely. I mean, Dale, I agree 100% with everything you just said. I wish all the manufacturers and vendors bought us, and then I could just sell that subscription to all the people using the devices.
But then the vendor would have to agree to
Yeah.
allow you to reuse it. I'm sure you would have some vendors right now that would say, okay, we want you to analyze our data, but by the way, you can't give that data to anyone else. We signed a contract with you. Or do your contracts allow you to reuse the data?
They do currently, yes. We are. So we have folks who they manufacture firmware. I mean, the interesting thing about a lot of this is there's this like the illusion that they control their firmware in a lot of cases. You can just download it many times unencrypted, unauthenticated directly from the internet. And then they want to act like you can't look at this. Like, what do you mean? Yes, we plan on doing both. Now, to your point, if a particular manufacturer says, hey, we want this to be an exclusive thing just for us, and then maybe we want to build like a service around enabling our clients to query this data of ours, great. We're all ears. So that would be that piece. There's just from a go-to-market perspective, there's unlimited end users in a much smaller number of manufacturers, and selling to manufacturers, while we certainly recognize that is the That's the ultimate like goal. That's the number one priority, right? Those sales cycles are longer. They're technically more challenging for a handful of reasons. They end up being bigger deals at the end of the day, obviously. But if I were to say, not to pick in on a particular vendor though, a large network appliance vendor, if we can sell to them, that would be amazing. But why would I not sell to their 10,000 customers when I can analyze their firmware? Why wouldn't I do that? So that's why we are doing it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, that's fine. No, that's helpful. I'm kind of running out of time here. I just wanted maybe as a last thing, is there some important issue we haven't discussed about that you wanted to raise? I mean, we're talking about a pretty new market here, pretty new company here in NetRise. Is there something that we should be looking for in the next year or two that we haven't talked about?
Well, I mean, I think we did touch on it a bit. Like the horizontal nature of this problem, I think, is really important. That was like a fundamental thing. The way we're approaching the market, which I know I've heard you talk about countless times. That's the challenge here, honestly. Like the technical challenges are there, but the go-to-market's going to be that. I can't think of anything in particular that we didn't.
Well, let's just hit on that horizontal, because I didn't jump on that.
Yeah.
I totally understand it from a technical standpoint, right? The technical problem is a technical problem, whether it's a device sitting at level 1 in the Purdue model, or a device hanging off of the corporate network, or some IoT device somewhere. It's all analyzing firmware. I think the tough part, though, and where the vertical issue might come into play, is you mentioned Log4j. If I'm not terribly concerned whether I have that inside my security perimeter in my ICS.
Sure.
Because if someone's inside my security perimeter, why bother with Log4j? Just send a command to do whatever I want and it'll do it, right? These devices have no authentication. So why do I care about that? And I think that while I understand the analysis would be that way, I could see that the risk tailoring, and I've dealt with this a little bit in the OT detection market, is it's kind of a function of exposure, maybe process impact, safety impact, even security posture. If the device has a terrible security posture, one more vuln isn't going to really matter to it. So I do wonder a little bit in terms of the presentation of the analysis, if that isn't going to be vertically dependent more than the analysis itself.
I mean, to me, kind of what you just laid out reinforces the horizontal nature of the issue in this way. You're exactly right. If these PLCs have Log4j and it's air gapped, like you're not going to do anything. Like it's already on. Like there's all these other problems. And those markets, medical devices, whatever, certainly feel like a higher degree of pain, and understand like the safety outcomes here can be really, really bad. But we're ignoring like maybe it's security cameras at a bank, and that has a Log4j vulnerability, and that thing's connected to the internet, and they pop that, and now they use that to laterally move to get into the corporate side of that bank. So that's what I mean. Like that's why. Sure, in your PLC example, I couldn't agree with you more. But that's why we're not only focusing on ICS and PLCs or anything in particular. Like that's why the horizontal nature of what we're doing is, I think, one of the critical components. It also allows us to get way more data from disparate types of devices that can allow us to infer different things, which goes back to the data model and goes back to the data science and machine learning stuff that we're going to be doing. We don't only want data from like one particular vertical. It's all relatively homogeneous to some extent. Like sure, there's differences between a Siemens and a Schneider PLC, of course. But it's not like it's not. Then we start bringing in security camera, like all these other things. It gets more interesting.
Yeah, no, I like it in the sense that it's a strategy. It's a position. The market will be what the market will be, and we'll see whether you're right or wrong in a couple of years, whether it's too early to go to horizontal or not. But I would imagine at some point in time it will be a horizontal market. It's just a question of whether it's now or years from now. And you know, your guess, I always respect someone that's putting skin in the game, right? you believe it. It's your company's push. So we'll be watching that. And I wish you and the NetRise team luck. We'll be watching what's going on. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time, Dale.